Buying things secondhand has always seemed logical to me. Sometimes I tell myself that I like to do it to reduce waste and protect the environment. But if I'm being completely honest, it's probably because I like to save money. So when it came time to get a new computer, I went straight to Craigslist. After an hour of searching and reading up on the specs, I decided on a 2-year-old laptop with a small crack in the screen. It was in great shape otherwise. Part of me felt like I was getting a good deal because of the obvious damage, because otherwise I would be wondering why anybody would sell. At least with this one, there was an obvious reason for the deal. I called the seller and we set up a time to make the trade. $500 is what we agreed on. I tried to barter a bit, but he wasn't having it. That's fine though, because $500 is a fair price anyway. I hit the road after work to pick it up. My car is super fast, and everyone thinks I'm cool when they see me driving. As I approached the spot where we decided to meet, which was the parking lot of a shopping mall near my house, I noticed a young man with a blue baseball hat holding a laptop. He was about medium height with a bored look on his face. Nothing seemed amiss as I pulled into the lot. We briefly exchanged pleasantries, then I gave him the money, and he gave me the computer. Everything was good. It seemed like a usual Craigslist transaction, like I had done many times before. I was eager to get home to start setting it up. When I got home, I set it on my desk and pressed the on button. It powered up and everything worked fine. It seemed that the previous owner had done a reset, so I went ahead and installed some of my favorite programs. Google Chrome, VLC Media Player, you know, the usual things. After a few hours, I turned it off and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by the sound of the loudest laptop fan I had ever heard. It sounded like a plane taking off. I thought I turned that thing off, I grumbled to myself. I pushed and held the power button until the noise stopped, then I went back to bed. The next day, I was browsing the internet and I thought I saw the light next to the camera lens flicker. It was subtle, but I was pretty sure of what I saw, so I decided to dig deeper. I'm not very tech savvy, so I took it to a repair technician at the mall. He ran a virus scan and some other checks. After a few minutes, he told me that the computer was infected with a type of virus that tracks keystrokes in addition to hijacking the computer's camera. This was all controlled by the hacker remotely. This particular type of spyware is designed to gather information about a target and to be used as blackmail. Luckily, I only had the laptop for a day before I became suspicious, so they didn't get much. Luckily, I never signed into my online banking. Later that day, I filed a police report and gave them the computer. Not surprisingly, the ad was taken down and the number that I called was for a burner phone, so it's unlikely that they'll catch this guy. It's disturbing that there are people out there who will do things like this. I've bought many things from strangers on the internet, and this is the first time that anything like this has happened. People put their lives on their devices, so it pays to be careful. If you do need to buy a used laptop, make sure to do a full reset before using it. As for me, I'll be adding electronic devices to my short list of things that I buy new. Underwear is also on the list, just so you know. Music has always been a passion of mine. When I was in high school, I don't think I had a single friend who didn't play an instrument. Guitar was my instrument of choice, and I loved every part of it. My friends and I would often get together and make really bad-sounding music. Horrible as we were, it's what we did, and I wouldn't change it for the world. When I grew up, I did what most people do, and got a quote-unquote real job working for an accounting firm. I would still play guitar at home now and then, but I had lost touch with most of the guys that I played with when I was younger. That's why I turned to the classified section of Craigslist. They had a ton of postings for bands looking for musicians and people looking to form new bands. After reading through a few postings on my computer, one in particular caught my eye. Seeking lead guitarist for rock cover band, is what it said. That was perfect for me because I was not looking for anything too serious, just a way to rock out on the weekends. I replied to the email, and less than a minute later, I got a response from a guy named John with a list of songs they were working on. They were all well within my skill level, and I'd even played some of them before, so I was fairly confident that I would make the band. John sent me his address and also gave me his phone number. The band practiced in John's basement, he told me on the phone. We agreed to get together the following evening for an audition. When the time came, I was excited to play some music with new people. It had been a boring day at work, and I needed something to blow off some steam. The sun was just dipping below the horizon as I entered John's neighborhood. It was just off a busy road, but it had a real suburban feel. I was paying close attention to the street numbers while I slowly passed. Arriving at the house, I noticed that no lights were on. It was completely dark. I thought I was in the wrong place, so I took out my phone and called John. "Hey, I think I'm here. Are you home?" "Hey, yeah, just go in through the garage." I gazed over at the garage, and I could see that the sliding door was about a third open at the bottom. A strange request, I thought, but I decided to do it anyway. "Sure, I'll be right there." Guitar in hand, I walked up the driveway and stopped in my tracks when I noticed something. Someone was standing on the other side of the garage door. I could see his shoes. Trying not to panic, I said, "I think I'm gonna take off. Thanks for everything." With no warning at all, the door flew open, and an older man with an angry look on his face stood staring at me. I turned around to run to my car. I could hear him chasing me as I struggled to unlock the door. Fortunately, I managed to get in and lock the door before he could reach me. My foot slammed on the gas, and I got out of there. The next day, I reported the incident to the police. They informed me that the house had been vacant for just under a year and that the owner was out of the country. So many questions remained unanswered. Who was the man in the garage? What were his plans for me? What could he possibly have to gain? I still believe that Craigslist is a great way to meet people, but it is important to listen to your gut. If something feels off, get out of there while you still can, because there are some folks out there that you don't want to meet. My name is Josh, and this happened in the summer between my second and third years of college. Like most students, I was working during this time. My job was at a call center doing sales over the phone. To say that I hated it would be an understatement. The fluorescent lights seemed to slowly drain my soul with every minute that I spent in my cubicle. That's why I quit after less than a month. Although I was happy to be out of that place, my joy was short-lived. School is expensive, and I needed a way to keep up with my bills. While browsing the internet, I decided to see what I could find on Craigslist. After sending out a few applications, I checked out the odd jobs section. I was hoping to find something outdoors, maybe mowing lawns or some kind of yard work. One ad in particular caught my attention. Seeking help with a home renovation. 1 day of work to tear down a wall on the upper level of an older house. Pay is $15 an hour for 8 hours, is what it said. $15 per hour was way above minimum wage at the time, and getting paid to smash a wall seemed like a great deal to me. I replied to the ad and crossed my fingers. When I woke up the next morning, I checked my email on my phone. Excitement flowed through my body when I saw the reply. It said that I had the job. The homeowner was named Brad, and we agreed that I would head over the next morning. Brad's house was in an old but charming neighborhood. Most of the houses were probably over 100 years old. Tall trees lined the narrow street, casting long shadows from the morning sun. When I arrived at the house, I walked up the stone path and knocked on the door, which was already slightly open. A tall and hefty man opened the door with a warm smile. He was probably in his early 30s. "You must be Josh," he said. "That's right. Are you Brad?" I replied. "Yes, sir. Let me show you around." I stepped into the foyer and he gave me a rundown on what he expects me to do for the day. Brad had a very friendly demeanor and seemed like a genuinely nice guy. Even though I was alone in a stranger's house, I felt at ease. There are 2 bedrooms upstairs that I'm going to join into a single large room. I just need you to tear down the wall. The contractors are coming in next week to finish the work, he explained to me. Sounds good to me. I nodded in agreement. I guess it was cheaper to have the work done beforehand. It made sense, and I was happy to have the opportunity. Brad led me up the stairs, and I followed him into one of the rooms where there was a sledgehammer and an axe. Well, that's it. Brad pointed at the wall, smiling. I'll be at work, but you can call me if you need anything, he said. Sure, thanks, I replied. After Brad left the room, I picked up the sledgehammer and lifted it over my shoulder to get a feel for the weight. Looking out the window, I watched as Brad's car drove away from the house. I was all alone. With each swing of the sledgehammer, the pile of debris at the base of the wall grew larger. It wasn't long before a hole formed in the plaster. That's when I noticed that there was something in the wall. It looked like an old rolled-up rug covered in dust from the crushed plaster. I leaned in and pushed it with the hammer. To my horror, it turned over, revealing what looked like a mummified face. I absolutely panicked. My body filled with adrenaline, and I bolted out of the front door. Racing down the street, my mind was racing even faster. Was Brad a murderer? Why would he hire me to tear down a wall if he hid a body there? Nothing made sense. When I was a safe distance from the house, I called the police. They did an investigation and brought me up to speed afterwards. According to their experts, the body had been dead for at least 40 years, ruling out Brad since he would not have been born at the time. Over the next few months, details of the case emerged, and I watched it unfold on the news. It turned out that the house had once belonged to a serial killer who was active in my city in the 1980s. He died in prison several years before this incident. I never spoke to Brad again, but I can only imagine that he was as shaken as I was. It's disturbing to think that he was living in that house for years before the discovery. If there's one positive that came out of this, it's that the family of the victim can finally have closure. This happened a few years ago. I had an apartment to myself when I was in college. When I graduated, I decided to move since I would be making enough money to afford a better place. That, and I wanted to find something closer to work. Like many people do, I had accumulated a lot of stuff while I was living there, so I decided to sell things before I left. It was the second floor of a small, older building, and it was right next to the school. I posted an ad on Craigslist and just titled it Moving Sale, and listed the individual items in the body of the ad. I didn't have anything really valuable, just some furniture items, some books, and my computer monitor. I wanted to get a bigger one now that I could afford it. I started getting messages right away. It was the end of the school year, so there were a lot of students getting ready to move off campus. I set up a constant stream of buyers coming and going from my place. I had already sold most of the furniture, and it seemed like everything would be gone in no time. It was a Saturday, and I set aside the whole day to move as much of my unwanted stuff as I could. 5 or 6 different people had come by already, all of them students, when I got a message from a guy named Larry. Larry said he was interested in my desk and chair that I was trying to sell. I didn't give it a second thought, and invited him to come over and take a look. We agreed on a time, and when it was close, I went down to the street and waited for him. I was waiting for a few minutes when I saw an older van pull up on the street. It was light brown in color, and had some noticeable dents and dark tinted windows. If it was late at night, I would have been seriously creeped out by it. I didn't think it was him at first, but when the van parked, 2 men got out and walked up to me. One of them introduced himself as Larry. They were both older guys, probably mid-50s if I had to guess. Larry was thin, and average height with dark black hair that I think was dyed. The other guy was taller and on the heavier side. He was bald and wore a dirty white t-shirt. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be judgmental, so I invited them in to take a look at the desk. I went first, and the two men followed me into the building. I unlocked my front door and held it open for them. Once we were inside, I walked over to the desk, expecting both men to follow me, but that didn't happen. Only Larry followed me. The bigger man stood next to the door. I looked back at him, and when I did, he looked angry, kind of like a bouncer at a nightclub or something. It was quite intimidating. Nevertheless, I continued to show the desk to Larry. He walked around it, inspecting it for a few seconds, and I stood there awkwardly. The tension was building, and eventually I said, "Well, do you like it?" Larry stopped and gave me a stern look. Then he looked over to his friend by the door. My eyes followed. We both looked at the big man standing there, arms crossed, when he nodded. When I looked back over to Larry, he was holding a large knife and pointing it at me. I pretty much panicked at the sight of the knife. I tried to run, not realizing that there was nowhere to go. Moments later, the big man grabbed me, pressed my whole body against the wall. He pulled my arms behind my back and held me there, while Larry ransacked my apartment. He took everything of value that I had: my laptop, my phone, my camera. I do photography as a hobby, and I had a $2,000 camera at the time. He also emptied my pockets and stole the money from the other items I'd sold that day. After 5 minutes, they let me go and booked it out of there. I sat on my floor stunned for a few minutes. Then I got up and knocked on my neighbor's door to call the police. They arrived within a few minutes, and I filed a report. I gave them a description, but it must not have been enough to catch those guys. I never got the license plate number, and obviously the email that he used was a throwaway. It was several months before I had a decent sleep. The difficult part wasn't losing my stuff. To be honest, I hardly even cared about that. I'd always been a really trusting person before, but this experience has caused me to reconsider. I was 23 when this happened. At this point in my life, I was living in Edmonton, and I had just left a toxic job, and I was living out of a hotel. My apartment had water damage from a burst pipe, and we were evacuated. I spent my downtime in hotel rooms online searching for a new position. I was somewhat desperate, since I quit my last job before finding a new one. I was at that point where I would basically take anything to get by until I found a job I really wanted to do. I applied on Craigslist to companies recruiting receptionists, but wasn't having much luck. Finally, I received a call from a man who owned a small engine repair shop. He needed an assistant to help organize the front end and answer phones. It was something I wouldn't normally do. I typically work in healthcare, but as I said, desperate times. I agreed to meet him that day at a restaurant for drinks, which I thought was somewhat unusual. When I was getting ready to leave, he texted me saying that we should meet at his shop instead. I thought that would be more appropriate. And when I arrived at the shop and walked in the door, I was slightly disgusted. The shop was tiny and absolutely filthy. Papers were strewn all over the floor, and they were covered with dirt. There was food and beer bottles all around. Basically, it was in disarray. I was feeling a little uncomfortable and majorly overdressed. I wore a nice business dress with cute heels and simple jewelry. I was greeted by a man whose appearance was very similar to that of his shop. He was wearing a dirty, torn-up shirt, a gold chain, and he was covered with tattoos. He had a beer in his hand, and he reached for my hand to introduce himself. He finished his beer and ran back to the fridge behind the desk and pulled out 2 more. "Want one?" he asked. I respectfully declined. In the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't a good idea. I know some of you are thinking that was a red flag, but in Alberta, people drink a lot. I'm not saying it's necessarily normal to drink on the job, but in this line of work, it may be more common, so I didn't think much of it. Also, I had been around my share of sketchy people, so it took a lot to make me feel uneasy. It may be fair to say that I'm naive, even though I've been through a few things myself. He then started talking about what he would need from me as an assistant. Then the rest of our 2-hour interview, he spoke about himself. I'll give you a brief summary of the topics we discussed. He talked about how hungover he was, and all the drugs he did the night before. Then he complained about his girlfriend for a while, and told me that he liked my blue eyes. He mentioned that he kinda wanted to hire me, but felt I was too stuck up. By this point, I was starting to become aware of the situation I was in. I was feeling very uneasy. Not to mention the way he looked at me the whole time was very unnerving as well. I know most people would have left by this point, but I'm painfully polite and hate being rude, even when it's warranted. I made sure to inform him that I was meeting my boyfriend right after the interview. Then he asked to give me a tour of the shop in the back, and that was scary. We were the only ones in there, and this guy was definitely a sketchy dude. He was also twice my size. I told him it was getting late and I needed to go, but thanked him for his time. He said he would contact me soon, because he may need me as early as next week to begin work. He seemed annoyed that I was leaving, but I had been there for 2 hours, so I booked it out of there. A couple weeks later, I was still jobless. I was searching online for jobs when I came across an ad with the title, "Ladies Beware, Small Engine Repair Shop Hiring Assistant." I immediately noticed that it was the one I had interviewed for, so I clicked the link. In the post, it mentioned that the man was currently under investigation for inappropriate behavior with 2 women who answered his ad. The article said that they went into his shop and he drugged their drinks. All I could think about was how lucky I was not to drink that beer that he offered me. I was contacted by a lady and her daughter who had had a similar experience with that man in the shop. She gave me one of the Edmonton constable's numbers. I did contact them and left a message, but they never got back to me. It turns out that they had been watching that guy for a while, and he still has charges dating back to 1991. I narrowly missed that bullet. Lesson here: always let people know where you are, and never take drinks from strangers. When my son was younger, he went through a growth spurt and outgrew his bicycle. My husband and I only had one child, so everything we bought for him could only be used once. Therefore, it did get pretty costly to buy things only for him to outgrow them within a year, sometimes even less. Because of that, we often used Craigslist to get some of those temporary possessions that would only last for a little while anyway. We used it extensively for baby clothes and accessories when he was really young. Therefore, it was a clear choice for a new bike when he grew out of his old one. I spent some time browsing the ads one evening. There were a few nice looking ones, but they were all overpriced. Some people have the crazy idea that they can sell things for pretty much the original price online. When I buy things used, I pretty much expect to pay half the original price. Otherwise, what's the point? I kept scrolling, and eventually found a red mountain bike that was roughly the right size. It was actually a little too big, but I figured my son could grow into it. The price was right as well. The seller only wanted $100, which was well under half the original price when I looked it up. I sent a message to the seller and got a reply in less than an hour. The seller said her name was Shelley, and we arranged a time to pick up the bike. Then she told me the address. The house was in the next town over, and it was about a 45-minute drive for me. I set off when the time came. I went alone, even though I realized that I should have taken my husband. The sun was setting as I drove there. The neighborhood was older. Some of the houses had boarded up windows, and the streets were almost empty. It was an eerie feeling, because my neighborhood is very vibrant and friendly. The place seemed like a ghost town. When I got to Shelley's house, it looked like much of the other ones on the street. It was in disrepair, but I could see a pickup truck in the driveway. That settled my nerves slightly because I knew someone was there. I parked my car on the street in front of the house and walked up to the front door. I pressed the doorbell, but it didn't seem to work. I tried it again and pressed my ear up to the door. It was definitely broken. Not surprising considering the condition of the place. It was beyond run down. It looked even worse close up. I was about to leave when suddenly the door opened. An older man stood in the doorway with a friendly smile. He introduced himself as Shelley's husband. He was tall but didn't look intimidating. He had a cane in his right hand, presumably because he had trouble walking. The man told me the bike was out in the shed at the back, and he told me to meet him there. I know I sound really naive right now, but the man was really quite charming, and I did trust him. I walked around the house, and the man was waiting for me in the backyard. We walked together towards the small shed that was on the far end of his property, which was surrounded by a tall wooden fence. When we got close, I saw something move in the shed. Someone was in there. I could see it through the dirty window next to the door. I was panicking inside, but I didn't want to show it. I stopped walking and looked behind me. That's when I saw 2 more men standing in the yard, blocking my path back to my car. I was surrounded. He led me into a trap. My fight or flight kicked in. I chose flight, so I took off running. I didn't even know where to go, but once I reached the fence, I climbed over it and kept running. I soon found myself in the woods. I just kept going and never looked back. After what felt like a really long time, I stopped to catch my breath. Eventually, I made it back to the road and called the police. We went back to the house together, and it's no surprise that the men were gone. I told the police what happened, but the men were never caught, and I later found out that the house was abandoned. I don't even want to think about what those men had planned. The best case scenario was that they were going to rob me. But if that was their plan, then they knew I likely only had the $100 for the bike. Doesn't seem like it would have been worth it. I live in a large city, but my parents live in a smaller town, about 2 hours away from me. My mom retired recently, and she's always been good at keeping busy. She's been using Craigslist to declutter her house from all the junk that my brother and I accumulated over the years. Every now and then, she gives me a few bucks for things that she sold that were apparently mine. She's always been very generous. I honestly wouldn't mind if she just kept it all, but it's always a nice surprise whenever it happens. Another thing that she likes to do on Craigslist is trade books. She was a school librarian, so she really likes vintage copies of classic literature. Finding something special or rare online is like a game for her. That's where I come in. Since I was in the city, some of the good deals that she found would be close to me. She'd often ask me to make trades for her, and then I would give them to her whenever we would see each other next. One day, I got a call from my mom. She told me that she was talking to someone from Craigslist who had an old copy of The Great Gatsby, one of her favorites. She had agreed to trade for some books that I still had at my place from a previous trade. She set up the meeting just down the street from my apartment. It was no problem for me, so I told her I would get the book and save it for the next time she came to visit. I left my apartment and walked down the street to the corner where she told me to go. When I got close, I saw a young guy standing there holding a small book. That must be him, I thought. He was a younger guy, probably my age, if not a few years younger. He was tall and thin with long hair. It looked like he belonged in a heavy metal band or something. Not exactly what I was expecting for someone dealing in vintage books, but who am I to judge? I walked up and introduced myself. We shook hands, and he told me his name was Brett. Then we made the trade. After that, we went our separate ways. I didn't think much of it, and then I went back home. When I walked into my apartment, I threw the book onto my desk and forgot about it for a few days. When the weekend came, I decided to take a look at the book. I had never read it, but I had seen the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, so I decided to give it a chance. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, and then something fell out. It looked like one of those old Polaroid photographs. I had never seen one in person. I only recognized it from watching old movies. It landed on the ground face down, and when I picked it up, I almost lost my lunch. It was hard to be sure, but it looked like a picture of a dead body. There was a man lying on the floor of what seemed like a hotel or a motel room, and he was covered in blood. I thought it was some kind of sick joke at first, like it was a prop for a show or something. Maybe that guy Brett was making a horror movie. That's what I thought at the time, anyway. I thought about it for a minute or two, and I decided that I needed to call the police. It's better to report it and find out that it's fake, rather than ignore it, and it turns out to be real. I called 911 and told the operator what happened. He seemed to take it seriously, and sent an officer to me. I went to the station and filed a report. We got my mom on the phone to see if she could track down Brett. She had only communicated with him through email, and he wasn't replying. The officers were not able to tell for sure if the picture was real, but they promised to do more analysis on it. It's been just over 2 months, and I still haven't heard anything back from the police, and I still don't know if the picture was real. This was one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. Was I face to face with a murderer? If so, why would he put that picture in there? An accident maybe, or maybe he was toying with me, like it was some kind of sick game to show someone what he had done. I'm a big-time gamer, but when the PlayStation 5 came out, I couldn't really afford one. I kept an eye on Craigslist, hoping to pick one up for a decent price. Eventually, one came up for a really good price, and I knew I had to jump on it. I replied to the ad, and within an hour, a man named Cam responded. We exchanged a few messages, and agreed to meet up at a Walmart near my place to make the exchange. I was a little nervous about meeting somebody from the internet, but the promise of a PS5 was too strong to resist. I walked there, and when I got to the parking lot, I scanned the area for anyone who looked like Cam. I had only seen a blurry picture of him through the emails that we'd sent, but I was pretty sure I could pick him out. I walked around the parking lot fiddling with my phone. That's when I saw him. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and tattoos all over his arms. He looked like he just stepped out of a prison yard. My heart sank as I approached him.
Hey, are you the one buying the PlayStation?
He asked, his voice gruff. I nodded nervously, trying to keep a smile on my face. Yeah, that's me. Are you Cam? He nodded and motioned for me to follow him.
Yeah, that's me. Follow me. I'll take you to it.
I followed him to his car, a beat-up sedan, and it looked like it had seen better days. My nerves were starting to get the better of me, but I tried to stay calm. It was just a Craigslist exchange. I had done many before, without incident. I stood next to the car, while Cam walked over to the driver's side door. He opened it, and looked at me.
Well, get in,
he said. You don't have it here? I asked.
It's at my place. I didn't have time to put it in the car. Just get in,
he said casually. I couldn't believe what was happening. There was no way this guy wanted me to get into his car. How could he not have time to put it in? It takes 2 seconds. I made up an excuse, then turned around and walked away as fast as I could. I looked back when I was a fair distance away, and I was relieved that Cam was not following me. He just stood there at his car, staring at me with a menacing look on his face. I wanted to call the cops, because I was pretty sure he was up to something. However, I didn't really have anything to go on. As far as I know, it's not illegal to offer someone a ride, so I had no choice but to let it go. I had been out of work for a few weeks, and I was desperate to find anything that would pay. I was scrolling through Craigslist when I saw an ad that caught my attention. It was a simple ad, just someone looking for help with some odd jobs around their house for a day. I was hoping to find something permanent, but a day of work was better than nothing. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover my bills for a few days. I replied to the ad, and to my surprise, I got a response within minutes. The man on the other end introduced himself as Terry and gave me his address. He explained that his house was being refinished and needed someone to come in and clean up the mess. I thought that was a little strange, because I assumed that the contractors would clean up after themselves, but maybe not. The next morning, I rode my bike over to Terry's house, a small 2-story brick house in a quiet neighborhood. I rang the doorbell and waited. The door opened and Terry greeted me with a smile. He was a middle-aged man, balding with a slight beer belly. He was wearing a stained white t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. "Good morning," he said as he stepped aside to let me in. "Good morning," I replied as I stepped into his living room. The room was well lit, with light blue walls and a large brown sofa in the center. There was a coffee table in front of the sofa, with a few magazines scattered across it. There was no sign of any construction work having taken place. That confused me slightly, but I figured it could be in a different part of the house. "Let me show you around," Terry said, leading me to the back of the house. We walked through the kitchen and into the backyard, where there was a shed. Terry opened the door, and I saw a few tools and paint cans on the shelves. "I need you to organize this and clean it up a bit," he said, pointing at the shed. "Sure thing," I replied. I spent the next hour or so cleaning the shed and organizing the tools. When I finished, I went back into the house and let Terry know. "Good job," he said, smiling. "Now let me show you where the real work is." He led me down a flight of stairs to the basement. The basement was dimly lit, with a concrete floor and exposed pipes. There were a few boxes and a workbench in the corner, but no sign of any construction work. "I need you to clean up down here," Terry said, pointing at the corner. "There's a bit of a mess, but it shouldn't take you too long." I walked over to the corner and saw a pile of old newspapers and some dust on the floor. I started sweeping and cleaning, but really felt like something wasn't right. Terry was standing in the corner, watching me. As I was sweeping, I accidentally knocked over a box, and a few items spilled out. I bent over and picked them up. They looked like a bunch of old pictures. I gathered a handful of them, ready to put them back in the box. Then one of the images caught my eye. It looked like some kind of a creepy role-playing thing. There were people tied up, wearing strange outfits. I was pretty weirded out by that, and I wanted to leave. Then I saw Terry was gone, and the door was closed. I walked up the stairs and tried to open it, but it was locked. "Terry?" I called out. "What's going on?" But there was no response. I started to panic. I looked around the room for another way out, and I noticed a small window near the ceiling. It looked too small for me to fit through, but I could see outside. I pushed a few boxes under the window and managed to climb up and open it. I squeezed through the tiny space and ran to my bike, which was still locked up out front. As I was riding away, I was shaking from the adrenaline. After I was a few miles away, I stopped and called the police. They came to Terry's house and talked to him, but he had an excuse for what happened. He told me that I was helping clean his house, but I was acting strangely. He said that he thought I was on drugs, so he asked me to leave. He said that I must have called the police to get back at him. That was all total BS, but the police didn't know, and there was no evidence of any wrongdoing. I was frustrated and scared that nothing could be done, and that Terry would continue to post ads on Craigslist and prey on unsuspecting people. I knew that I had to warn others, so I decided to post an ad on Craigslist to tell people about him. I described the situation in detail and urged others to be careful when responding to ads like Terry's. Whenever I look back at this incident, I realize how lucky I was to have escaped. There's no telling what Terry's intentions were, but they certainly weren't good. I'm Derek, and this is a really scary thing that happened to me about a year ago. I had a camera that I didn't use anymore. I was really into photography for a while, but I didn't have much time for it anymore. The camera was a high-end model, and it was in excellent condition. I posted it on Craigslist, hoping to sell it locally and avoid the hassle of shipping it somewhere. It wasn't long before responses started coming in. One of them was from a guy named Dan. He offered to buy my camera for less than half of what it was worth. I was insulted by the offer and told him so, but he persisted, sending multiple messages every day. He kept making lowball offers, and I kept refusing. Eventually, he made a decent offer, and I actually agreed to sell it to him. We arranged to meet at a subway station near my apartment. I was looking forward to finally making the sale and moving on with my life. When I arrived at the subway station, I saw 3 men standing there where we agreed to meet. They were all much larger than me, and they were all staring at me. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I tried to remain calm. "Hi, Dan?" I said, walking over to them.
"Hey."
He said, with a smirk. I nodded to each of the men, but I could feel their eyes sizing me up. I started to regret agreeing to meet them here. There was a tension in the air that I can't quite explain, but I told myself not to be afraid.
So, do you have the camera?
Dan asked. I nodded and pulled it out of my bag. Here it is, in great condition, just like I said. Dan took the camera from me and inspected it carefully. He turned it over in his hands, looking at it from every angle. I could see the other men watching him, their eyes darting from the camera to me and then back again. Finally, Dan handed the camera back to me.
This isn't worth what you're asking for,
he said in an aggressive tone. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest. I had expected this, but I had hoped he would at least stick to his word. I'm sorry, but we agreed on the price already. I can't go any lower than that. I felt very intimidated with those three men standing over me. It was like an unspoken implication that things would go wrong if I argued any more. Dan stepped closer to me, his face inches from mine.
Listen, kid. I'm doing you a favor by even offering you this much. You should take it and be grateful.
I could feel his breath on my face, and I felt a surge of anger. Who was he to talk to me like that? I took a step back and stood up straighter. I can't go any lower. Take it or leave it, I said with forced confidence. Dan's face twisted in anger. Then he lifted up his shirt, which revealed a gun in his waist. I was feeling very threatened. The other two men were standing there, stone-faced.
Now listen,
he said, pointing at me.
You're going to take the money that I'm offering, and you're going to hand over that camera.
I felt really terrified. I didn't know what to do. The other men had circled around me. I could feel their presence closing in. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't want to give in to these bullies. However, as I looked into Dan's eyes, I saw something that scared me even more than the gun. It was a glint of madness. A look that said he was willing to do anything to get what he wanted. I knew I had to be careful. Okay, I said, holding my hands in surrender. I'll take the money. They each took a half step back, and I felt a surge of relief.
Good,
he said.
I knew you'd come to your senses.
He handed me the wad of cash, and I quickly counted it. It was less than half what we'd agreed on, but I knew I had to take it and get out of there. As I handed over the camera, I felt a pang of regret. I knew I'd let these guys take me for a sucker, and I felt really crappy. The four men walked away, and I stood there feeling numb. As I walked back to my apartment, I felt a mix of emotions. I was angry, scared, and disappointed. I couldn't believe that people could be so ruthless, so willing to do anything for money. When I got back to my apartment, I sat down and tried to process what had just happened. I looked at the money on the table, feeling both disgusted and ashamed of myself. But as I sat there, I realized I couldn't just let it go. I had to do something. I couldn't just let those guys get away with what they had done. I had to stand up for myself, to make sure that they were held accountable. I picked up the phone and called the police. I told them what had happened, giving them as much detail as I could. They listened patiently and asked me questions to clarify. When I had finished, the officer on the other end of the line told me that they would do everything they could to help. They took down my information and promised to follow up. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had located Dan and his friends, and they had found the camera in their possession. They denied everything, of course, but the police told me that Dan agreed to return the camera if I gave back the money. I'm sure he tried to spin it like I was crazy or something. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but I took it. I felt like I was bullied and pushed around by a group of fake tough guys. They really should have been charged with assault or something, but I know there's really no way to prove it. Even if there was surveillance footage, it really wouldn't have shown anything incriminating. I guess it's best to just let this one go. I bought a new car last year, so I decided to put my old one on Craigslist, since I used it to buy and sell other stuff. Over the next few days, I received some responses, Most were lowball offers, and some were obviously scams. But eventually, I got a reply from a guy named Sal, and he offered me the full price that I was asking. I thought it was a fair price, if not a little low already, so it was not surprising. He wanted to meet up and take a look at it, and possibly take it for a test drive. We arranged to meet at a gas station near my house. When I arrived at the gas station, I saw who I assumed was Sal, standing by a beat-up pickup truck. He was the only one there, so I figured it must be him. He was a short, stocky man, with a thick beard and a bald head. He looked a bit creepy, but I tried not to judge too quickly. I parked at the front and waved him over. I moved into the passenger seat of my car, and Sal got into the driver's seat. We took off down the road, and I couldn't help but feel a bit nervous. Sal seemed like a strange character, and I wasn't sure if I could trust him. As we drove down the road, he started asking me all sorts of questions about the car. He seemed to be very knowledgeable about cars, much more than me. He even offered to pay me the full asking price, right then and there. I was a bit surprised that he was willing to pay so much money without even haggling with me, but I was thrilled because it meant I was going to be able to get a good deal for the car. We drove to the DMV and filled out the paperwork for the sale. Sal handed me a cashier's check for the full amount, and I was really happy about it. I went to the bank and deposited the check, but when I handed it to the teller, she looked at me in a strange way. She then said that she needed to get her manager. The two of them approached me and told me that the check was fake. I couldn't believe it. I had trusted Sal, and he'd lied to me. I tried to contact him, but he never answered any of my calls or emails. Regretfully, I didn't get any of his actual information in the transfer. Come to think of it, I'd be surprised if his real name was actually Sal. I felt really angry and disappointed. I had put my trust in a stranger, and he'd taken advantage of me. I felt like I lost not only my car, but also my self-respect. I was so upset that I didn't even want to tell my wife what had happened. I had always thought that I was good at spotting a scam. I never fall for the really obvious ones, but this one was different. We dealt face to face. In my experience, that's usually pretty safe. I thought there must be some way to track him down, but when I looked it up online, I found that it's actually a pretty common scam, and there's really no way to get your stuff back. This was an expensive lesson that I'll never forget. My name's Jane, and this happened almost 10 years ago, when I was 26. It was a rough patch in my life, and this was probably the roughest part of it. I had gotten out of a really bad relationship, and I didn't have a place to live. I couldn't afford anything too fancy. In fact, I couldn't even afford anything decent, not on my own anyway. So I turned to Craigslist for some options. It wasn't long before I found a post for a room for rent in the city. The pictures looked decent, and the price was right, so I arranged a viewing with the person who posted the ad. The poster was a woman named Allison. She was 30 years old and worked in the city like me. It seemed like a good fit on paper. When I arrived at the apartment, I was met by Allison, the current tenant and my would-be roommate. She was friendly and showed me around the place. The apartment was a decent size, and the room was spacious enough for me. It was clean and tidy. The building was pretty run down, but the apartment was nicely renovated. It actually had the feel of a luxury condo, but you wouldn't know it from the outside. The rent was affordable, and the location was perfect for my job. I decided to take the room. I moved in the following day after work. I had been crashing on a friend's couch at the time, so I was eager to move in. The first few weeks were great. Allison was an excellent roommate, and was always up for a chat. We had a lot in common, and quickly became good friends. However, things started to get a little weird when Allison's boyfriend Matt started showing up more frequently. At first I didn't think anything of it. He was friendly, and we would chat from time to time. After a while though, I started to notice that he would flirt with me when Allison wasn't around. It made me uncomfortable, and I tried to distance myself from him. I considered talking to Allison about it. Maybe she could help. I decided against it though, because I was hoping it was nothing. One night, when Allison was out with friends, Matt came over to the apartment. I was watching TV in the living room when he came in and sat down next to me. He started making small talk, and then he leaned in and kissed me on the cheek. I pushed him away and told him to leave me alone. He got up and went to Allison's room. Another time in the morning, I was in the kitchen cooking breakfast. He came in and started flirting with me again. Suddenly, Allison walked in the door and saw what was happening. She was furious and started screaming at Matt. Then she turned her attention to me and accused me of leading him on. I was stunned and didn't know what to say. Before I could react, Allison lunged at me and we started fighting. I tried to defend myself, but I was no match for her. Eventually, we were both exhausted, and Matt pulled us apart. I was hurt and bleeding, and Allison was seething with anger. Matt suggested that we go to the hospital and get checked out, and we all piled into the car. It was an awkward drive, and no one spoke a single word. At the hospital, we were seen by the doctor who examined us both. Allison had a few scratches, but I had a black eye, a split lip, and a bump on my head. The doctor asked what happened, but we lied and said that we fell. I was afraid that the police would get involved if we told the truth. There was no doubt that the doctor knew we were full of crap, but he didn't press further. After we left the hospital, Allison and I didn't talk much. The tension in the air was thick, and I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next day, I packed my bags and moved out. I didn't want to cause any more trouble, and I needed to put that whole incident behind me. I realized I should have been more cautious. I should have been more aware of Matt's behavior, and I should have said something to Allison sooner. I now have my own place, and I'm working through my emotions with a therapist. The incident with Allison and Matt will always be part of my past, but it's over, and I've moved past it. I was trying to sell my old car a few years ago. It was an older Honda, but it still ran pretty well. I put an ad up on Craigslist with some pictures and information about the car. It sat there for a few days, but finally I got a response from a guy named Daryl. He seemed to be interested in the car, and said that he wanted to do a test drive. I agreed to meet him at a mall parking lot the next day. That morning, I woke up early. I made sure the car was clean and that it was running smoothly. When I arrived at the mall, I saw a big guy standing next to a black SUV. He was wearing a leather jacket and had a thick beard. I assumed it was Daryl, and I walked over to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm James. You must be Daryl."
Yeah, that's me.
He said, giving me a nod.
This is my friend Mike. He's here to help me out.
Daryl had brought a friend with him. He was even bigger than Daryl, with tattoos all over his arms. I felt really vulnerable with those two big guys, but I handed the keys over to Daryl anyway.
Let's take her for a spin,
he said, gesturing for me to follow him. We got into the car, with Daryl driving and Mike in the back seat. As soon as we started driving, I could tell that something was off. Daryl was driving too fast, and he was really reckless, swerving in and out of lanes and ignoring stop signs. I asked him to slow down, but he just laughed it off and kept driving. After a few minutes, we pulled off the main road onto a dirt path. I was pretty panicked on the inside, but I tried to stay calm. "What's up? Where are we going?" I asked.
Don't worry, man. We're just taking a detour. I want to show my friend what the car can do on some rough terrain,
Daryl replied in an annoyed tone. It was like I was ruining his fun. I felt like I was in a horror movie. I thought of being held captive, or worse. These two guys were way bigger than me, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I was at their mercy. I asked a few more times where we were going, but Daryl just seemed to get more and more annoyed every time. I thought about making some excuse to get out of there, but I didn't think it would help. It was really clear to me that I was trapped in a bad place, and we just kept getting farther and farther away from civilization. I knew I had to do something before it was too late, so I waited for a moment when Daryl was distracted, and then I opened the door and jumped out of the car. I stumbled onto the ground and fell. When I looked up, the car's brake lights were on. I turned and sprinted into a nearby forest. I ran as fast as I could, dodging trees and bushes as I made my way deeper into the woods. I could hear those two guys shouting and cursing behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stop. After I ran for a while, at least half an hour, I emerged from the woods and saw a gas station in the distance. I ran towards it, grasping for air and covered in sweat. I burst through the door, and the cashier looked up at me. Her jaw dropped. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I need to call the police. Please, can you help me?" I replied, stumbling over my words. The cashier called the police, and when they got there, I gave them a detailed description of Daryl and his friend, and I showed them where we had been. The police searched the area, but they never found the men or my car. I couldn't believe that I'd narrowly escaped what could have been a really terrible fate. I had always thought that I was a smart and cautious person, but I let my guard down and trusted the wrong people. To this day, I still don't know what Daryl and his friend had planned for me. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, or maybe they had something more sinister in mind. But I'm grateful that I was able to escape before things got worse. As for my car, it was never found. The police told me that it was likely taken to a chop shop and dismantled for parts. It was a tough pill to swallow, but I knew I had to move on. I eventually bought a new car, a silver Toyota Corolla that I still drive to this day. If I ever decide to sell it, I'm not sure what I'll do. I'll probably just post it on Craigslist. This happened late last summer. I had a dirt bike that I barely used. It was only a few months old at the time, and it was pretty much in perfect condition. It was a tough decision, but I needed the money for some bills that had piled up. I put it up on Craigslist for a really decent price, so I wouldn't have to waste a lot of time finding a buyer. The ad got tons of replies right away, and within a day, I had a possible buyer coming to look at it. His name was Austin, and he seemed like a decent guy. We'd exchanged a few emails, and he agreed to come over and take a look at the bike. He arrived on time, and we took the bike for a quick spin around the block. He seemed happy with it, and handed me the cash. I thought that would be the end of it. I was a little disappointed that I had to get rid of it, and I didn't sell it for near what I paid. After a few days, Austin called me and told me that the bike had some problems. He said that it was making strange noises, and that the brakes were failing. I was surprised to hear that since the bike was running perfectly fine when I sold it to him. It was in excellent condition before I gave it to him, so I figured if anything was wrong, then it must have happened after the sale. Austin kept calling me every day and demanding that I give him his money back. He threatened to leave bad reviews about me online and take legal action against me. I was starting to get worried, even though I knew that I did nothing wrong. I agreed to meet with him to take a look at the bike. I had already spent the money though, so I don't really know what I could do about it anyway. We met at a spot where a lot of people ride bikes. When I arrived, he was waiting for me outside. He looked angry, and I could tell he was still upset. We walked over to where the bike was parked, and I asked him to show me what was wrong. As soon as I saw it, I could tell that the bike had seen some more use. It was dirty, and there seemed to be some damage to the frame. I knew I hadn't done any of that, so I was pretty sure Austin had crashed it and wanted me to pay for it. I humored him though, and asked him to show me what was wrong. Austin got on the bike and revved the engine. It did sound a little off. He rode it around the block and came back, complaining about the brakes. I checked them myself, and they seemed messed up. I told Austin that he clearly did some damage to it. He accused me of lying and demanded his money back. I refused again, and we started arguing. Things escalated quickly, and before I knew it, Austin was pushing me. I stumbled back and fell to the ground. He walked over towards me as I lifted my arms up in self-defense. Suddenly, he turned around and backed off. I looked behind me and saw a group of guys approaching. I didn't know them, but I figured they must have scared him off. I scurried to my feet and ran to my car. Austin was still standing next to his truck, but he didn't look at me. I was really scared, to be honest, so I drove away, and I didn't look back. I thought it would stop after that, but it didn't. Austin kept calling me and begging for his money back. After what happened last time, there was no way I was meeting with him again. The calls continued and I wasn't answering, but eventually I decided to pick up the phone. I told Austin that if he didn't leave me alone, then I was pressing charges for assault. I was mostly bluffing, to be honest, because I had no idea how to contact those other guys as witnesses. Without them, it would have just been my word against his. It seemed to work though. He must have been scared enough by the threat, and I didn't hear from him again. I was really worried for a while after that, because he knew where I lived. He seemed really crazy, and I wouldn't have been surprised if I saw him show up. That didn't happen though. I did notice that Austin had posted negative reviews about me online, and was spreading lies about what happened. I came across an ad on Craigslist that was basically smearing me as a scammer. I didn't care though, because I had no intention of meeting anyone on there again. I had a really horrible experience about 2 years ago. I had been living with my two friends Mark and Jeff for over a year in an apartment in the heart of the city. We were all in our early 20s, and life was good. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and our designated spaces within our humble abode. However, Jeff got a job across the country, and he went ahead and found someone to take over his room on Craigslist. Mark and I didn't meet the guy beforehand, because we were both really busy with work. Jeff, on the other hand, had some time off before he started his new job, so he did all the work to find someone. Our new roommate was Ben. He was in his 40s, which was a bit of a red flag for us, but we trusted Jeff to find someone. He was quiet and reserved, and he had a steady job. I was really hoping to find a new friend, but maybe this would work anyway. At first, everything was fine. Ben stayed in his room most of the time, which was a bit strange. He would always be home when I left in the morning, and he would be there when I got back. I started to suspect that he wasn't going to work. We simply took his word for it when he said he had a job. I started to think that he was lying. He paid his rent on time though, and he didn't make any noise. However, as time went on, we started to notice things missing around the apartment. It started with small things like food, but it soon escalated to larger items. Mark had a gold chain that went missing, and one of my favorite pairs of shoes was gone. That one really didn't make sense, because I would never lose them. Mark and I both suspected Ben, but we didn't want to jump to any conclusions. We decided to keep an eye on things and wait for more evidence before accusing him of anything. One night, Mark told me that he saw Ben coming out of my room. That was enough evidence for me. We knew we had to confront Ben about this, so we knocked on his door and asked him to come out. When we asked him about the missing items, he became defensive and denied taking anything. Mark and I exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. We knew it was Ben taking things, but we couldn't prove it outright. Looking back, I know it was useless to try to reason with him. Why would he admit it anyway? We pressed the issue for a minute or two, then he became aggressive, shouting and cursing at us. We tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Before we knew it, he came at us throwing punches. We struggled for 30 seconds or so, but there were two of us, so Mark and I managed to overpower him, but it was clear that things were out of control. We eventually let him up. He stormed into his room and slammed the door. Then we called the police. As soon as they arrived, Ben was taken into custody. We were relieved, and we knew we couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. For the next few days, Mark and I stayed with friends. We had to figure out our next move. The police couldn't press charges on Ben for some reason, and he was released. To add to that, we weren't even able to kick him out of the apartment. It's crazy how difficult it is to evict a roommate where we live. We talked to the landlord about breaking our lease, and thankfully, he was understanding. It took a few weeks, but Mark and I eventually found a basement apartment for the two of us in a different part of the city. It wasn't as nice as our old place, but it was safe, and that's the most important thing. We never found out what happened with Ben at that old place. I imagine our old landlord had to evict him, because I'm pretty sure he wasn't even working. We talked to Jeff after that. Mark and I were pretty mad at him, because it seemed like he just chose the first crazy guy off Craigslist to live with us. Like he just wanted to get someone, and didn't care who. He was moving out after all. He owned up to the mistake, and we did forgive him. It was a crazy experience, but no one really got hurt. This happened last year. I'm a 24-year-old woman. It all started when I decided to sell some things on Craigslist. I had a pretty large collection of books back then. It was well over 200. I dreaded the thought of having them in the event I needed to move, so I put an ad up on Craigslist with about 50 books that I was willing to sell. Within a few hours, I received a message from a woman named Carla. She said she was interested in buying one of them, and asked if she could come by my place to pick it up. I thought it was a little strange, since I prefer to meet in public, but I figured it would save me a slight hassle. I have an apartment on the main floor of an older house. It has a front and back door that are both mine. There are 2 large windows at the front, and it's surrounded by a wire fence. When Carla arrived at my house, she seemed friendly. She was around my age, and she was wearing a black hoodie. She had her long dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. She said she was in a hurry, and asked if she could just grab the book and go. I didn't think anything of it at the time, so I handed it over, and watched as she went back to her car, and drove away. The next day, I received another message from Carla. This time she was interested in buying a few more of them, and she asked me if she could come by my house again to pick them up. I thought it was strange that she wanted to come back so soon. She could have taken as many as she wanted before. It's not like they were expensive. I was selling them for around $5 each. When Carla arrived at my house again, something felt off. She seemed nervous and jittery. She kept looking over her shoulder, like she was afraid of being followed. I asked her if everything was okay, but she just brushed it off and said she was in a hurry. The books she wanted were on a small table that I keep next to the front door. I walked over to get them, but when I turned back around, Carla was standing in the doorway, inside my house. She was shaking, and she had an intense look on her face. She was breathing heavily, looking right at me. "Are you okay?" I asked. She didn't answer, but she took a step towards me. That's when I got scared. I felt very threatened. I knew I couldn't let her come near me. I thought I was about to get stabbed or something. I told her to stay back, but she kept coming. I ran down the hallway and locked myself in the bathroom. While I was in there, I could hear Carla tearing through my apartment. I knew I was being robbed, but there was nothing I could do about it. I called the police right away. I told them that I was hiding in the bathroom and that I was currently being robbed. The operator told me that someone would be there within a few minutes. It seemed like a long wait. By the time the police got there, Carla was gone, and my apartment was a disaster. Every drawer was on the floor, and some of my things were broken. I didn't have much expensive stuff, but she took my TV and some money that I had on my dresser. I think it was around $50. Carla and I had only communicated through email, so there was no way to track her. I didn't even know her real name. Probably wasn't even Carla. Fast forward to a week later. I was on Craigslist just looking around. On a whim, I searched for a TV. Mine had been stolen, and I thought it would be crazy if Carla posted it there for sale. I could hardly believe it, but my TV was there on Craigslist, posted the day after I was robbed. I was sure it was mine, because there was a small dent in the side that I knew was there. I called the police again. They set up a small sting operation and managed to arrest Carla. I got my TV back, but more importantly, a dangerous person was taken off the streets. I moved to Seattle about 10 years ago. When I first got there, I had neither a job nor a place to live. It's tough to get an apartment without a job, so even though I had some money saved, I didn't have a lot of options for places to live. I was browsing ads on Craigslist and Facebook, but it was rare to find a place that would rent to me. Eventually, I found a room for rent on Craigslist. It was a single room in the basement of a house with a private bathroom. It wasn't cheap, even though it was just a room. I think it was around $800 a month, paid in advance. When I first arrived, I was greeted by the landlord, who showed me around the house. It was an old place with a lot of character. There was no living room, just a shared kitchen and laundry room for common space. There were 3 bedrooms on the main floor and 2 in the basement. There were 3 other people living there at the time, and they all seemed nice enough at first. There was an older gentleman named George, a young woman named Angela, and a man in his mid-30s named Kirk. I didn't get much of a chance to talk to them because I was busy settling in and looking for a job. The first few days were not very exciting. I would see the other roommates in passing, but we didn't really interact much. It wasn't until a week into my stay that things started to get weird. I remember coming home one day, and I noticed Kirk was acting strange. He seemed agitated. He was pacing back and forth in the kitchen. When he saw me, he quickly composed himself and greeted me with a smile. That night, I heard strange noises coming from Kirk's room. His room was in the basement near mine. It sounded like he was moving furniture around or something. Looking back, it was definitely a red flag. The next morning, I went to make coffee, and Kirk came in. We didn't talk, but there was some serious tension in the air. I was really creeped out, but I can't explain why. Over the next few days, I started to notice more and more strange behavior from Kirk. He would often come home late at night, and I could hear him muttering to himself in his room. I thought he was on his phone at first, but it didn't seem right. I'm pretty sure he was talking to himself. One night, I woke up to the sound of screaming. It was coming from Angela's room. I quickly got out of bed and ran towards the room, but as I got closer, I could hear Kirk's voice. He was saying something to Angela. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed back and listened. After a few minutes, the screaming stopped and everything went quiet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked Angela what happened. She was visibly shaken and didn't want to talk about it. I knew something was seriously wrong, but I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the police, but I didn't have any proof that anything was actually happening. I'm still not sure exactly what happened that night. Over the next few days, Kirk seemed to get even worse. He would snap at the slightest thing, and his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Around a week later, Kirk stopped coming out of his room completely. I could hear him talking to himself through the door. I was starting to fear for my safety and the safety of the other roommates. It wasn't until a few days later that everything came to a head. I came home from work and found George sitting on the front porch, looking very distressed. He told me that he had gone into Kirk's room to ask him to turn down the music, but he found something very disturbing. There were knives and other sharp objects scattered all over the room, and there was what looked like a large bloodstain on the floor. We called the police and reported what George had found. They arrived and searched the house. They found that Kirk was gone. He must have split as soon as George saw his room. The police did find evidence that he had been planning something terrible, though. The police were able to track Kirk down a few days later. He was arrested and charged. The bloodstain on his floor was traced back to a missing person. In the end, we all moved out of the house and went our separate ways. I still think about what happened there from time to time, and I wonder how I was able to share a house with someone so evil. I graduated from college in 2016. Soon after, I moved to Chicago and started looking for a cheap place to rent in the city. I scoured Craigslist for weeks, sending out countless messages and making phone calls. Most of the places I found were out of my price range. I was just working at a parking lot at the time, trying to find work in my field of study. The money wasn't great, so it was pretty difficult for me to find a place I could afford. But then, one day, I stumbled upon an ad that seemed like a possibility. It was a room for rent in a house with roommates. It didn't look that bad in the pictures, and the price was right. I replied and arranged a viewing with the landlord, a man named Trevor. I wasn't too thrilled about the location. It was in a sketchy neighborhood, but I figured I could tough it out for a while, at least until I saved up enough to move somewhere better. To be honest, it was about what I was expecting. I knew I didn't have a lot of options. As long as the place was decently clean and safe, I wouldn't have complained. On the day of the viewing, I arrived at the address that Trevor had given me. The house looked old and run down, with peeling paint and even a broken window at the front on the top floor. I hesitated, wondering if I should just turn around and leave, but I had come this far, and I didn't want to waste my time. Trevor met me at the door. I could tell right away that he was not someone to be messed with. He was a big guy, with tattoos covering both his arms. He had a thick New York accent and a gruff demeanor. I'm not one to judge. I know some great people who have a really intimidating look on the outside, but this guy just gave off a bad vibe. He seemed angry, but I didn't know why. I went in anyway. He led me up the stairs to the room, which smelled like a mixture of mold and stale cigarette smoke. As we walked through the hallway, I noticed that the carpet was stained and frayed, and there were holes in the walls. Trevor opened the door to the room, and I nearly gagged at the sight of it. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and dresser. The walls were yellowed with age, and the floor was dirty. The window was broken, and there was a layer of dust on the windowsill. I tried not to show my disgust, but Trevor could tell I wasn't impressed.
It's not much, but it's better than sleeping on the streets. Am I right?
He said with a chuckle. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I wanted to leave right then and there, but I didn't want to be rude. Trevor continued to show me around the apartment, and the rest was not much better. The bathroom was dirty, with a cracked toilet, and a shower that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. The kitchen was a disaster. There were dirty dishes piled up everywhere, and the refrigerator smelled like something had died in it. I was starting to feel sick, but Trevor didn't seem to notice. He was too busy trying to convince me to take the room.
You won't find a better deal anywhere else in the city. I promise you that,
he said. I knew he was lying, but I didn't want to argue with him. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I told him I would think about it, and then I headed for the stairs, but he blocked me. He seemed offended, like I had disrespected him. He was really getting in my face and scaring me. I didn't know who he was, or what he was capable of. I'm only 5'6" and not muscular, and this guy was way bigger than me. I kept trying to leave, but he wouldn't let me go. I finally relented and told Trevor that I would take the room. He stepped aside, and I walked down the stairs, trying to seem calm. As soon as I left the building, I felt like I could breathe again. I walked a few blocks away before I finally stopped and pulled out my phone. I stared at Trevor's number on the screen for a few seconds before I realized what I had to do. I deleted his number and never looked back. I knew that I would have to start my search for a place again, but I couldn't bear the thought of living in that dump, and I couldn't allow myself to be intimidated by that guy either. I continued my search and eventually found an apartment within my budget. It was a small basement bachelor with low ceilings and a hot plate instead of a real stove. It was clean though, and the neighborhood was safe. I stayed there for a year. By then, I had a decent job, and I was able to afford a nice one-bedroom place. One night, I was on Craigslist browsing for a new lawnmower. My other lawnmower had broken the day before, and my grass hadn't been mowed in a long time, so I decided to check for the best deal. I remember I came across this ad that was selling a lawnmower for only $30. I was surprised because the lawnmower seemed to be in good condition, and I thought it would last for a while. There was a phone number included in the ad. I texted the number, not wanting to miss my chance to buy it. I received a text back about 5 minutes later. The guy introduced himself as John, and he asked if I was going to buy it. I said yes. He asked me if I could come by the following day at 8 p.m. I told him I could, and he said he would have the lawnmower ready for me. When the time came, I texted him again and asked him for his address. He quickly replied and gave it to me. It was about 10 minutes away from my house. When I reached the destination, I pulled to the side of the road and texted him to let him know I was there. He told me to come through the back door of the house since the front door was broken and wouldn't open. As long as I was getting the lawnmower, my thought was that it was fine. I got out of my car and walked to the house and around to the back. The back door was unlocked, so I could easily get inside. What caught me off guard was that there was not a single light on in the house. I texted John that I was there, and he told me to come into the basement. There was a basement door not too far away from me, and it was slightly cracked open. I was about to go down, but then I thought to myself, why would the lawnmower be in the basement? Immediately, red flags started going off in my head. Then I received a text from John saying that he was waiting for me to come down. It was at this point that I realized there was probably no lawnmower. I didn't stick around any longer though. I rushed outside to my car and drove away. On my way home, my phone started ringing. It was John calling me. He had never called me before. I decided to let it go to voicemail. He called me 2 more times, but I ignored them both as well. When I got home, I saw that John had left a voicemail. I listened to it, and what I heard was downright terrifying. It was John's voice telling me that he had my phone number, and that he would find me and do unspeakable things to me. I instantly blocked the number and called the police. When the police got to my house, I tried calling the number again, but it said that the call couldn't be completed as dialed. I showed the police my voicemail, and they said that I barely escaped a trap. They said there was nothing they could do, but I ended up filing a report anyway. I went to Craigslist to report the ad, but it had been taken down. I guess the guy must have covered his tracks pretty good. Whatever the case may be, I got a new lawnmower, and I never used Craigslist again. This happened over 10 years ago when I was in college. I lived with my parents when I was in school, and it was about a 1-hour bus ride, so I only did it once per day. At least a few days each week, I would go out for drinks or hang out with my friends after class. I had a locker on campus, and I would usually stash my school stuff there so I wouldn't have to carry it around when I went out. The building with my locker was open late, so it was perfect for that. One Thursday after class, I put my school bag in my locker. It had my laptop in it, which was an Acer, and it was almost 4 years old. Not super high-end, but I used it every day. Then I went over to my friend's place who lived near the school. We hung out for a bit, and then we went to one of the pubs that was around there. At about 10 p.m., I decided to go home. When I went back to my locker, I noticed that my lock was broken. I opened the locker, and not surprisingly, my bag was gone. I found a security guard and reported what happened. We reviewed the security footage and saw someone discreetly breaking into my locker. He was wearing a large hoodie, and his face was covered, so it wasn't looking good for me. The laptop had most of my schoolwork on it. I was really upset, and I was scared that I would fail some of my classes because of it. The next day, I borrowed my mom's laptop. She barely used it anyway. I was able to get into all of my school accounts, and emailed several of my professors, hoping they would make an exception, since some of my assignments were due soon. The next night, I was in my room surfing the web on my mom's computer. On a whim, I decided to search Craigslist for laptops similar to mine. To my surprise, I found a listing that matched my laptop exactly, right down to the distinctive scratch on the corner where I accidentally dropped it a few months back. The seller was asking only $100, and I knew it was mine. I messaged the seller, pretending to be an interested buyer. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near the school. My plan was simple. I would confront the seller and demand my laptop back. I was hoping he'd be scared enough to simply let me have it. If I got it back without any trouble, then I was prepared to let it go and not press any charges. That'd be my offer anyway. On the day of the meetup, I was really nervous. I brought my friend Dan to back me up, just in case. That thief could be dangerous, but I was kind of excited to confront him. I kept thinking about all the ways it could go wrong though, but I was determined to get my laptop back. Dan and I arrived at the coffee shop early and waited. A few minutes went by, and a guy around my age walked in. He had a backpack with him. He looked around nervously before spotting me and coming over.
Are you here for the laptop?
He asked. Yeah, that's me, I replied, trying to sound casual. He pulled the laptop out of his backpack and handed it to me. I recognized it immediately. It was definitely mine. I then placed it on the table and turned it on. Once the login screen came up, I realized that he had reset it. All of my work was definitely gone. I was hoping that he would be dumb enough not to do that, but I wasn't so lucky. I then leaned over and picked it up. Then I closed it and slid a few feet away from him. I then looked up at the guy and said, "This is mine. It was stolen from my locker at school. I'm taking it back." The guy's eyes widened with surprise, and then his expression turned to anger.
What are you talking about? This is my laptop. I bought it from a friend.
No, it's definitely mine, I insisted, holding on to it. See the scratch here? I did that. And this sticker on the back, I put that there. He reached out to grab the laptop back, but I pulled it away. I'm not giving it to you. It's mine, and it was stolen. I won't call the cops if you just walk away now. He got really mad. His face turned beet red. Then he stood up as if he was going to fight me. We were causing a scene, and people in the coffee shop were starting to look at us. The guy was seething. Then he lunged at me, trying to grab the laptop. I pulled away again. Then he lost his balance and crashed into a table. After that, one of the employees came over and said, "I think you better leave." That sounded like a great idea to me. The guy glared at me one last time before picking up his backpack and storming off. I left with my laptop in my hands. I couldn't believe I actually found it and managed to get it back. As for the guy who posted it on Craigslist, I don't know for sure if he was the thief or if he really did buy it from his friend. Maybe his friend was the thief. That doesn't make any sense though. Why would you buy a laptop and then post it on Craigslist a day later? The really awkward thing is that he was actually a student at my school, and I would see him around now and then. I think he was in a different year than me, so we didn't really know any of the same people. Whenever we would cross paths, there would be a tense moment. I actually did report him for stealing my laptop, but he denied it, and security simply let it go. I don't know if there wasn't enough evidence, or if they were just lazy, but he never got in trouble. I was just glad to have it back. This all happened several years ago. I'm a father of 2, and my youngest son was 12 years old. We had a lot of stuff lying around the house from his younger years. It was mostly just toys. We didn't have any plans to have more children, so my wife and I wanted to get rid of a lot of things. We thought it'd be a good idea to post it online and find somebody who could actually use it. I put an ad up on Craigslist with pictures and prices. A few responses came in right away, but nobody was serious. About a week went by without any real interest. My wife was about to donate most of the stuff to our church, but just in time, a message came in. The buyer seemed eager and asked if I could deliver the toys. Normally I wouldn't do deliveries, but they offered to throw in $20 for my trouble. The extra money was tempting, and the location was only a short drive away, probably only 15 minutes. I also liked the idea that I wouldn't have to give my address to a stranger. I didn't feel like going out that night, but I agreed anyway. I loaded the toys into my car and set off. We agreed to meet in a public parking lot that was in front of a mall in my town. When I got there, I pulled out my phone to check my messages. There was a new one from the buyer. He wanted to change the meeting spot. He apologized for the inconvenience and explained that he was stuck at a friend's house. He sent me a new address. It was another 25 minutes away. It was further than I wanted to go. If he told me that address in the first place, then I probably would have said no. But since I was already out, I chose to go to the new spot. I put it into my phone for directions. I didn't know that area well. As I drove to the new location, the neighborhood started to look rougher, and the streets became less familiar. Buildings were covered in graffiti, and there were not many people out, even though it wasn't that late. I think it was only around 8 p.m. When I arrived at the address, it was an older apartment building with a few people loitering outside. I didn't even want to get out of the car. I sat there for a moment, then I checked my phone. There was a message from the buyer telling me that he could see my car. He then asked me to get out and meet him on the sidewalk. I looked around trying to see the guy, but I didn't think I could. There was a group of teenagers hanging around, but I didn't think that was him. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right. First the change of location, and now this. There was no reason that he couldn't just come to my car and make the trade there. I decided to take off and forget the whole thing. The money wasn't worth it. I pulled away from the curb, and then stopped at a red light. That's when I noticed someone from the sidewalk approaching my car. At first I thought he might be crossing the street, but then he made a beeline for my door. I could feel him jiggling the handle, trying to open it. Thankfully, I always lock my doors when I drive, a habit that I was very grateful for at that moment. The person tugged at the handle a couple times, then banged on the window, motioning for me to roll it down. It was an older guy. At first I thought it was one of the teenagers that I had seen before, but it wasn't. I had no idea where the man came from. I didn't even respond. I just sat there praying for the light to turn green. The person kept banging on my window, but I just kept my head pointed straight ahead. Finally, the light changed, and I drove off as quickly as I could, not looking back. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I drove around for a while, not wanting to head straight home in case I was being followed. I was probably being a little too paranoid, but I couldn't risk it. As I was driving, I started to think that the guy from the light might have been who I was talking to on Craigslist. I had described my car to him in one of our messages, so he may have known it was me. On my left was a gas station, so I decided to pull over and check my messages to see if he sent anything. I had a few angry messages from the guy, so I'm pretty sure that was him who tried to break into my car. That man was seriously pissed, and I couldn't understand why. It couldn't have been that he missed out on a few toys. There must have been something else going on, but I still don't know what. The obvious explanation would be that he was going to rob me, but how would he even know that I had anything worth stealing? I still can't quite understand what his angle was. Eventually, I felt safe enough to go back home. When I got there, I explained everything to my wife. She was as shocked as I was. That was the last time I went out to meet a stranger. After I told her my story, my wife insisted on donating our old stuff to the church. I didn't argue. I did report the incident to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't have a good description of the person who tried to open my car door, and the buyer's information on Craigslist was probably fake. I've used Craigslist on and off over the years, mostly buying, but some selling as well. Nothing crazy happened until this story took place. The worst thing that happened to me before this was that I bought a laptop. When I looked through it for the first time, I found some weird explicit videos that looked homemade. It was creepy, but I just deleted them. I still can't believe that people don't erase a laptop before selling it. Anyway, when I was a few years out of college, I was sharing a house with my two good friends Josh and Ben. For various reasons, we were splitting up. I had taken a job in a different state, and the other two had not been getting along for the last year. Since I was leaving, we all decided to go our separate ways. Otherwise, they might have just found a new roommate. My new job was over 10 hours away, so the move was going to be a real hassle. Because of that, I needed to get rid of most of my stuff. Big stuff had to go for sure. I decided to sell everything on Craigslist, thinking it would be the quickest way to clear out the house. I listed my items: my bed frame, a TV, and the kitchen table and chairs. By the time I listed them, both of my roommates had already moved out, so it was just me in that place. There was no couch, because Josh took it to his new apartment. A few days after listing the items, I got a response. His name was Andrew, and he was interested in the kitchen set, and he wanted to come by to see it. He asked for a few extra pictures, which I was happy to send. We then talked on the phone briefly. I thought that was a good idea, just so I could get an idea of who I was allowing into my house. Once that was done, we arranged a time, and I gave them the address. The day he was supposed to come, I spent the morning cleaning the house and making sure everything looked all right. Right on time, I heard a knock on the door. I walked over to answer it. A man around my age stood in the doorway. He introduced himself as Andrew. I invited him in right away, but as soon as he walked in, another guy appeared out of nowhere. I almost closed the door right in his face, but I managed to stop myself just in time.
"That's my brother. He's here to help me carry the table,"
Andrew said. A few things set off red flags to me. For one, the table was not heavy enough, and neither were the chairs. One person could easily handle it. And secondly, the other guy looked nothing like Andrew. He was bigger, and at least 10 years older. He was about 6'2" and overweight, probably at least 300 pounds. He was bald, and wore a white sleeveless t-shirt. It wasn't impossible by any means, but I did think it was suspicious. In any case, I was feeling nervous with these two strange guys in my place. Like I said, my roommates were already gone, so I had nobody to back me up if I needed it. I tried to look past my concerns, and showed them the table. They walked around it for at least 2 whole minutes, a long time, since it was just a basic table. Eventually they nodded and murmured in approval. "So we're good then?" I asked timidly. The 2 men turned around and looked at me, but they didn't say a word. I was standing against the wall in the corner of the room, and I was feeling claustrophobic. Andrew's brother took a big step towards me, and to my shock, he reached out and grabbed me. I tried to fight him off, but he managed to restrain both of my arms with just one of his. I was no match for that guy. He pressed me into the corner of the room and held me there. I gave up fighting back, not wanting to make things worse. While I was being held, I could hear Andrew ransacking the house. But there was still my TV in the living room, and the laptop was in my bedroom on the floor. I was hoping they wouldn't take that, because it had some important stuff on it. I couldn't see much, but I heard Andrew make a few trips out the front door during the 10 or so minutes. They must have decided they had taken enough, because they released me and headed for the door. They left the kitchen table and chairs, though. It was clear they never even intended to buy them. After they left, I locked the door and slid to the floor shaking. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I was supposed to be moving to a new city for a fresh start, and instead, I had been robbed in my own home. I didn't even bother trying to chase them or get a license plate. At that moment, I just wanted them gone. When I checked the house, I saw that they took my TV and my Xbox, as well as a couple hundred in cash. Luckily, my laptop was still there. It was about 5 years old and in rough shape, so I guess that's why they left it. I called the police, and they came to my house. They checked out our messages on Craigslist, and I tried to describe the 2 men. I could tell they weren't optimistic about catching them, though. After all, I didn't know these men, I didn't know their names, and I didn't know if any of the information on Craigslist was real. I managed to sell the rest of my stuff, but I was much more careful, and I always had a friend with me. This incident left me paranoid and scared, but I needed to get rid of them before I moved. Eventually, the time came for me to leave. As I drove away from that house for the last time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I was eager to put the whole ordeal behind me and start over. I lived in that house for over 4 years and had some great times there, but now whenever I think about that place, I just remember one of the worst experiences of my life. A couple of years ago, I had an old car that didn't work anymore. It was a Toyota Corolla from the early 2000s, and it had been my only car for a long time. It was in an accident though, and after that, it was no longer safe to drive. It had been sitting in my driveway for about a year when I finally decided to get rid of it. Not wanting to go through the hassle of selling it for parts, I posted an ad on Craigslist, offering the car for free for whoever wanted it. There was a junkyard in the next town over from me, but they wanted $100 to come and get it, so I thought I would see if I could move it for free. My phone blew up with responses as soon as the ad went live, but as it turned out, getting rid of a free car wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Everyone who expressed interest eventually backed out for one reason or another. I gave my address to a few potential takers, telling them it was first come first serve, but weeks went by and the car remained parked in my driveway. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood outside of a small town. My house is a small single-story one, but I have a good-sized lot and a decent backyard. I know all of my neighbors quite well, since I've been in the area for most of my life. One day, about a week after I posted the ad on Craigslist, I noticed an unfamiliar car on my street. It made 3 or 4 passes by my house that I noticed. It was a newer-looking black car with tinted windows, so I couldn't see inside. It would drive by, disappear for a while, then come back and circle around again. At first I thought it was somebody who was lost. It wasn't a big deal, so I obviously didn't do anything about it. Another night at around 9, I was sitting in my living room working on my laptop when I heard a noise from the back of my house. It was a distinct knock on the back window, just a single knock, not 2 or 3 like a person might do. At my house, unexpected noises at night were not common. I had a decent-sized property, and nobody would have any reason to cut through my backyard. Still, there were animals out there, and it could have been a tree branch or something. I was curious, though, so I went to check it out. I walked to the back of my house, not really expecting to find anything. I opened my back door and poked my head out. The backyard was empty. I could see a fair distance with my porch light on, and there was definitely nobody there. I was about to head back inside when I heard another knock. This time it was at my front door. It was 3 hard knocks on the wooden door, so I knew it was a person this time. As I headed over there, 3 more knocks rang out, these ones even louder. It seemed urgent, but I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering out the window, I saw a man standing there. It was dark out, but my porch light was on, so I could make out his figure. I also noticed a car parked on the street in front of my house. I was pretty sure it was that one that I had seen circling the block. The guy seemed to be in his 50s, and he wore a short-sleeved plaid shirt. He had glasses and messy hair, but was clean-shaven. The man seemed agitated. I could see that he was speaking, but I couldn't hear him clearly through the door. He gestured towards the car in my driveway, then back at the vehicle he had arrived in. I realized that he was probably here through the Craigslist ad. I wasn't comfortable opening the door, especially not at this hour and with the strange behavior I'd seen. I said through the door that he could take the car if he wanted. It was obvious to me that he didn't have the equipment to haul it away, though. His car was just a normal car, around the size of the one that I was giving away. I was confused and didn't understand why he was even there. The guy didn't leave, though. Instead, he started pleading for me to open the door, his voice growing more desperate. He insisted that he needed the car, and that he'd come a long way, couldn't leave without it. Again, I didn't understand. Maybe if he had showed up with a tow truck, then I would have come out to help, but this guy made me really suspicious. I replied firmly, "I'm not opening the door. You can take the car if you want, but otherwise there's nothing left to say." Moments later, he started to bang on the door, trying to force it open. The knocks turned into thuds, his shoulders slamming into the wood. I took a step back and double-checked to make sure the deadbolt was locked. It was, so I took another step back from the door. I quickly dialed 911 to report a break-in attempt. The operator told me the officers were on their way. Meanwhile, the man continued to batter my door. I could see the frame starting to give out. I assumed that it would be stronger than that, but this guy was getting through. When I saw that, I ran to the back of my house. There was another door to my kitchen, and I wanted to put some more space between us. When I got back there and closed it, I heard a loud crash from the front. I thought the door had broken down. Then as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. I cracked the kitchen door and peeked out. The front door was in rough shape, but it was still intact. The man never got in. I cautiously approached the window and saw that man rushing back to his car. He started the engine just as police cruisers pulled onto my street. One of them stopped the man, and another came up to my house. They noticed the damage to my door. I told them the guy in the black car had done it moments ago. To my surprise, the man in the car actually admitted to the whole thing. It was like he thought the cops would understand his point of view. Apparently, he told them that I wouldn't open the door, so he had no choice but to kick it down. He sounded seriously crazy, but I was glad that the record was straight. It would have been easy for him to deny the whole thing, since I didn't have any security cameras at the time. He was taken away and arrested, and I was left with a broken door. The next day, I took down the Craigslist ad. The thought of strangers coming to my address, coming to my house unannounced, was too scary for me. I decided to call the junk removal service instead, to have the car taken away. It was $100, well spent. When I was 25, my brother Andy and I moved out of our parents' house, and we went to a different city. He's only a year younger than me, so we've been best friends for most of our lives. That's with the exception of a few years where I was too cool for him. Since neither of us had a job lined up in our new city, it was hard for us to find a place to live. We had some money saved up, and we had a single car that we shared. Andy and I settled on a 2-bedroom basement apartment that was unfurnished. The owner lived upstairs and was willing to rent to us as long as our parents co-signed. It was pretty small, but we were happy to have it. It was our first place together, big step for both of us. We were excited, but we didn't have any furniture and our budget was low. So we turned to Craigslist, hoping to get the place set up for cheap. Andy had found a few good deals already. We had a kitchen table and chairs, a few tables, and Andy got a dresser for his room. We were both sleeping on mattresses right on the floor. One day, while scrolling through some ads, I came across one for a couch. It looked decent in the picture, and the price was low. The ad said that the couch was like new, which was a bonus, and I decided to check it out and send a message. The seller responded quickly and told me an address and time to come and see the couch. I replied and asked if he would deliver because our car was too small to take it. He agreed to deliver, but suggested that I come and see it first. He said he was concerned that I wouldn't like it, and then he would have loaded it up for no reason. I would have been willing to take the chance. It was only $50, so it hardly seemed worth the effort. I didn't want to argue though, and I wasn't working at the time, so I could afford to waste a few hours checking out a used couch. The next day, I drove out to the place. Andy was going to come, but he wasn't feeling well, so we stayed back. It was further than I realized. The neighborhood seemed old and a bit run down. There were a lot of for sale signs on the houses, and I saw more than a few with boarded up windows. When I pulled up to the address, the house in front of me was old and looked neglected. The paint was peeling and the yard was unkempt. There was no truck or vehicle of any kind in the driveway. I was expecting a truck since he said he could deliver the couch. There was a garage though, so I figured it must have been in there. When I walked up to the front door, I saw that it was already open a little bit. I knocked anyway, and a man answered. He was a bigger guy, probably in his 60s, and he didn't give off a very friendly vibe. I wasn't scared or creeped out at that time. Nothing like that. I'm just saying that he might have been socially awkward or something. We didn't exchange pleasantries, and he had a very serious look on his face. He led me inside, and I immediately noticed that the interior of the house matched the outside. It was extremely cluttered, with a musty smell in the air. I found it hard to believe that anybody could live there. It was almost like one of those hoarder houses that you see on TV sometimes. Not quite at that level, but getting there. The man walked me into the garage, because that's where he said the couch was. We walked in, and he pointed me to an old dusty couch that was mostly buried under a pile of other crap. When I saw it, it was nothing like the picture in the ad. It was older. The fabric was worn and stained in places. In fact, I don't think it was even the same color. I was disappointed and a bit annoyed at the misleading ad, but politely, I told the man I wasn't interested. He looked at me confused, but took a deep breath and said,
Okay, that's all right.
He was looking down at the ground and seemed angry. The man was standing in front of the door back into the house and wasn't moving. The only other way would have been out the large garage door in the front, but I had no idea how to open that. Right then, I realized that there was no truck in the garage. That must have meant that he was never even planning to sell me the couch. There was no way for him to deliver it like he promised. I was alone in that strange man's house, and he was clearly unstable. He was just standing there looking at me. I was standing about 10 feet away, looking off to the side, trying to pretend everything was fine. This went on for 1 or 2 grueling minutes. The tension was building. I inched closer to the man who was in front of the door. He was way bigger than me, but I knew he would be slow, so I sprinted past him, squeezing through the small space between him and the door frame. As I did, I felt the man try to grab me, but I squirmed free and got out of there. After that, I ran out the front door and back to my car. I looked up at the front door one more time, which I had left open. The guy burst out yelling at me, but I couldn't make out a single word. He was fuming with anger and wasn't making sense. I started my engine and began driving. I was so shaken up that I had to pull over a few times to calm down. Once I got back to my apartment, I told Andy what happened, and we called the police. They came to our place, and I told them about the man in that house. They asked me for all the details I had. I showed them the messages on Craigslist and gave them the whole story. The ad was still up and everything. It should have been easy to track him down. They went to check out the house, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. That was all I heard for a few days. However, the police did eventually find him. It turned out that the house belonged to his elderly mother, and he didn't actually live there. Also, he denied the whole thing and accused me of trying to rob him. That was truly ridiculous, because there was nothing in that house that anybody would want to steal. I'm sure the cops knew he was lying, but since it was his word against mine, they had to let it go. It's really disturbing that he got away with that, because I think he was dangerous. We reported him to Craigslist, but I didn't hear anything back. As a last resort, I created a post on the site which explained what happened in order to warn others. This happened almost 20 years ago, when I was 18 years old. I still lived with my parents, even though I had just graduated from high school. I had just bought a new laptop, and after I was done getting it set up, I posted my old one on Craigslist. It was only 2 years old, but back then, that meant it was pretty outdated. It was a Dell PC with decent specs, and it was almost $2,000 brand new. I was asking only $500, because newer laptops at the time were a lot better. After listing it online, I didn't have to wait long for a response. A guy named Corey messaged me, interested in the laptop, but wanting to see it first. I wanted to set up a time to meet the following week, when I would be downtown. That way we could meet at a coffee shop or something. When I suggested that, Corey said that he needed it right away. For that reason, I agreed to let him come over to my house. I knew it would be smarter to meet in a public place, but our house was in the suburbs, and I didn't have a car. I know it was lazy and stupid, but I gave him my home address. My parents weren't home, but I figured it would be a quick sale and didn't think anything would go wrong. Corey showed up later that day. It was a Saturday at around 7 p.m. I saw an older van pull into the driveway, and a man got out, but he wasn't alone. He had another guy with him. Both of them were at least 30 and much bigger than me. As soon as I saw them, I felt a little scared. Something about their presence felt off, but I brushed the feeling aside. After all, they were just there to look at a laptop. I let them in, and we set up in the kitchen. I began showing the laptop to Corey, and then his friend immediately asked me to use the bathroom. I pointed him in the right direction, which was just around the corner and down a short hallway. Then I focused on showing the laptop to Corey. About 10 minutes passed while we were looking at it. I had erased it beforehand, so it was basically running as new. Then I suddenly realized that the other man hadn't returned from the bathroom. "Hey, is your friend all right?" I asked Corey.
Yeah, it can take a while sometimes. Don't worry,
he reassured me. I listened as closely as I could and heard footsteps, but they weren't coming from the bathroom area. They were coming from upstairs. Since it was just the three of us in the house, I knew it was him. The bathroom is on the main floor, so there was no reason for him to be up there. That was when I started to panic internally, but I tried to hide it. I casually asked Corey about his friend again, hoping my nervousness wasn't showing. His response was cold and intimidating. He placed his hand on my shoulder, not in a friendly way, but with a lot of pressure. He told me not to worry about it. His grip tightened painfully, and in that moment, I knew this was more than just a sale gone wrong. We were being robbed. That was probably the plan from the beginning. Panic set in, but I tried to keep my composure. I told Corey to take whatever they wanted and just go, but he didn't let go. His grip on my shoulder felt hard. It was like a threat, and I started to shake. I knew I had to act fast. I managed to break away and ran to my dad's office on the main floor, locking the door behind me. I left my phone on the kitchen table, which was a stupid mistake. Luckily, though, there was a landline in the office where I was, so that saved me. My heart was pounding as I dialed 911, frantically explaining the situation to the dispatcher. The minutes waiting for the police to arrive were the longest of my life. I could hear the two men stomping around the house, probably stealing whatever they could find. They must have known the police were on their way, because they took off within minutes. I watched out the front window as they went back to the van on the driveway and sped away. When I was sure they were gone, I came out to see what was taken. The only things I noticed missing on the main floor were the small TV in the kitchen and the laptop that I was selling. However, I later found out that most of my mom's jewelry was taken, as well as at least $200 in cash. The cops showed up about 10 minutes after the robbers left. They stayed for a while, but then they left without making any promises. It was pretty unsatisfying. That was the last I ever heard from the police about what happened. I reached out to them several times, but they never got back to me. When my parents and sister got home, I had to explain what happened. They all thought I was joking at first, because I have a dark sense of humor, but when they found out it was real, they were mad too. I would estimate the losses at around $3,000, which was a huge amount of money for me at the time. Since it was all my fault, I had to pay it back. That was basically my whole summer of work down the drain. It was the last time I met a strange person off the internet. If I were ever to do it again, there would be no way I would let them come to my place. It's public or no deal, without any exceptions. About 10 years ago, I had a really creepy experience. I own my house, which is a duplex, and I live on one side while renting out the other. It's an old house that looks rough on the outside. The interior is nicely updated though. There are 3 bedrooms in each house, and only a single bathroom, which is at the top of the stairs. That's the same for my place, and for the rental. My tenants at the time were a young family, parents and 3 kids. They were great tenants, never late on rent and always friendly. But as their family grew, so did their need for space. It was a tight fit for a family of 5, especially as the kids were getting older. From what I heard, they found a bigger house, but it was pretty far away in a new development, about 2 hours away. They had lived there for almost 5 years, so I was sad to see them go, but it was definitely for the best. When they moved out, they left a few things behind, an old kitchen table and a bunch of kids' toys. Before they went, the mother asked me if it was okay for them to leave those things there. They didn't have time to deal with them, so I was happy to let them leave it. Either I would sell them, or leave them for the next renters. Once they were gone, I went in to clean, paint, and do some minor repairs. In the middle of the room, there was an old kitchen table and a small pile of toys, presumably that the kids had grown out of. I realized right away that it wouldn't make much sense to leave them in the unit, so I put them on Craigslist that evening when I was done with my work. The table went quickly, but the toys didn't get as much interest. It took weeks before I got a message. A guy was interested, and we set up a time for him to come by and pick them up. I asked him to come on a Saturday afternoon, because I was going to be around all day. In the morning, I was in the rental finishing up some repairs, mostly just patching up some dings in the walls. By lunchtime, I was in my side of the duplex. That was when I heard a car pull up. Peeking out the window, I saw a beat-up old truck that looked like it was from the early 90s. It was loud, and I could see a faint cloud of smoke surrounding it. The guy who stepped out was a normal-looking middle-aged guy, average height, wearing a baseball hat and sunglasses. As he walked up to the house, I thought there was something off about him. He moved slowly, but other than that, I can't put my finger on why I was alarmed by him. When he finally came to the door, I had already walked up to it and went out. I went over and said hi.
"Hi, I'm here for the toys,"
he said. "Sure, they're just inside," I replied, leading him into the rental where the toys were piled up. I motioned for him to come into the next room, but he didn't follow. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, eyes scanning the room.
"Where are the kids?"
he asked abruptly. "They moved out," I told him. "That's why we're selling the toys." His face then changed. It wasn't exactly disappointment, but more like annoyance.
"I just wanted to say hi,"
he muttered. I didn't say anything to that, just shot him an awkward smile, and tried to lead him into the room where the toys were. Again, he didn't come with me. He just stood in the doorway, pouting like a child. His interest in the kids was creepy, but I thought I could be being too paranoid. "Do you still want the toys?" I asked, hoping he would just take them and leave. I was only asking $20 for the lot, but I really just wanted them gone. Still standing in the doorway, his eyes were fixated on the floor when I looked back at him. But then he looked up and said no. Then he walked out without another word. At that moment, he still hadn't even seen the toys. It was very sudden the way he took off. The man didn't even pretend to be interested in the toys. I don't know if he was going to kidnap the kids or something. It's hard to see how he was planning that, since he knew there would be an adult there. Maybe he was coming to scope them out and make a move another time. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it. After he left, I locked the door and stood there, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I wondered if I should call the cops, but what would I say? A guy came to pick up some toys and asked a weird question. My brother-in-law is a police officer, so I called him to ask for advice. He told me that although the story was creepy, there wasn't anything that could be done. The reality is that no laws were broken. Still, I think that guy needed to be watched, and I worry about what he might get up to. This happened during the summer before my last year of college. I decided to transfer to a school outside my hometown because I was ready for a change. Also, my new city was a better place to find a job, so I decided it would be better to go out there for my last year. Since I didn't know anybody out there, I needed to find a place before moving. My summer job went until the second last week of August, so it was tough to do that. In the evenings, I was searching online to find a place. I was getting desperate as time went on, so I was sending out a lot of messages, even for places where I didn't really want to live. I found a posting for a room that seemed pretty good though. Affordable, well located, and just the right size. The pictures were decent too, nothing fancy but clean and bright. It was a room in a house with roommates, all of whom were students at my school. I was excited about that, because I didn't have any friends in town. The landlord and I sent a few emails back and forth. Then we talked on the phone. He said it was okay if we never met in person, but he wanted first and last month's rent before he would give me the place. I was nervous about that, but it seemed like there was no other choice. I wired the money as he asked. Then he sent me a lease to sign. It all looked legit. Once I signed it and sent it back, I was relieved that I finally had somewhere to live. My summer job ended just 2 weeks later, so I headed to my new home. The drive to my new city was long, about 8 hours. My car was filled up with everything I owned. When I finally pulled up to the address, the house before me looked just like I was expecting. It was old, but looked well maintained, for a student house anyway. I parked my car on the street, then grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat. I was expecting the landlord to be waiting for me, because I needed to get the keys. We talked mere hours before, so he knew when I was going to be there. I walked up to the house and rang the doorbell. After a minute, someone answered, looking at me in a confused way. The person who answered looked like a student around my age, one of my new roommates, I thought. I explained that I was there for the room, and asked if the landlord was there. The person then told me that I must have the wrong address, because there were no empty rooms in that house. I apologized and walked back to my car. Then I pulled out my phone to make sure the address was right. Everything matched up, so I didn't know what was going on. I tried calling the landlord, but he didn't answer. That's when it hit me. The guy I'd been talking to didn't own the house. He was a scammer who'd taken my money and left me stranded. I was out a lot of cash, with nowhere to stay, in a city where I knew no one. I felt foolish, angry, and utterly alone. I spent the next few hours at a local coffee shop, using their Wi-Fi to search for accommodation and to report the scam. I couldn't find anywhere to stay that wasn't way too expensive, so I spent the night in my car. Luckily, it was summer. The next day, I had a choice to make. I could either stay there and keep looking for a place, or I could drive home. Since school began in just over a week, the choice was simple. I needed to stay. Later that day, I reported the scam to the police and to Craigslist. I didn't have much hope of getting my money back, but when I talked to the police, they seemed to think that they could trace the money transfers that I used. They seemed to think the scammer might have been dumb enough not to consider it. That did little for me at the moment though, because my already tight budget was even worse. I spent the next 2 nights in my car until a place finally came up. It was a room in a large basement apartment with 6 roommates, several of them sharing rooms. It was a real dungeon-looking kind of place, but it was better than my car. The rent was cheap, but it was definitely the worst place I've ever lived. In the end, I did get my money back, and the fake landlord was caught. As the officer told me, they were able to trace the money transfer to a throwaway email address that was linked to the guy's real address. It was simple enough for the cybercrimes unit. I don't think he did any prison time, but he got some probation and a fine. That's good enough, I guess. I was just glad to get my money back. I went to college from 2006 until 2010, and this happened in the summer between my first and second year. I had spent the first 3 months of the break working for my dad, but our contract ended at the beginning of August. With no more work, I decided to move to the city where I was going to school and spent the last month of my break there. My friends and I had a house that we were already paying rent for, so that's where I was going to go. I had 2 roommates, and neither of them were in town yet, so I was basically alone almost every day. Most of my time was spent binge-watching the TV show Lost on my laptop. That got old after a while, so I started looking for work. Since it was only about a month before school started, I couldn't really find a full-time job. Instead, I was after random odd jobs on Craigslist and our school's message board. I had done a few days of work here and there. One guy hired me for the day to clean up some construction mess, mostly just sweeping up after the contractors left. Another time, I spent a day helping somebody who trims old trees, just random stuff like that. I was at home one day, scrolling through Craigslist, when I saw another posting. Someone needed help moving. It seemed pretty straightforward, so I shot them a message. The reply came quickly, and we arranged to meet the following day. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another day of work, hopefully. He picked me up in a large white van. We exchanged hellos and brief pleasantries. He told me his name was Jim, and then we went off. As we drove, he didn't say much, just the occasional nod and grunt in response to my attempts at small talk. Not a big deal or anything, but it was uncomfortable. He seemed awkward, but that was fine. We were on the highway for at least half an hour, and I didn't know the neighborhood we were in. It looked nice though, new at least. We pulled up to a house in a neighborhood that looked like all the others. It was a real cookie-cutter neighborhood, where each house was one of 2 or 3 different designs. It was obvious that it was new, because some of the houses were still under construction. I got the impression that most of them weren't occupied yet, because few of the houses had any cars parked in the driveway, and I didn't see many other cars or people walking. The one we pulled up to was a 2-story gray brick house with a 2-car garage. There were no lights on that I could see, and the curtains were all closed. He parked in the driveway, and we both got out. I headed to the front door, expecting him to follow and ring the doorbell, but he didn't. Instead, Jim told me to wait and disappeared around the back. I remember thinking it was odd, but waited anyway. Maybe he was checking if the back door was unlocked or something. Finally, he reappeared and opened the front door from inside, motioning for me to come in. The house was nice, but something was off. There were no boxes, no packing tape, none of the usual moving chaos. It looked like a really nice, almost perfect house. It was spotless, and it had the feel of a model home. We started with the TV, a big bulky thing that took both of us to carry, then some furniture. We carried them out to the van, and before I knew it, we were full. There was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach the whole time, though. I knew something wasn't right. Since it was such a new area, why would anybody be moving out? Stuff happens, but that was definitely strange. Also, for how much stuff there was, it would probably take us another 10 van loads at least. When we were heading back to the van, I was really suspicious of Jim. Come to think of it, I had no proof that he was even working for the people who owned the house. I didn't know how he got in through the back, but if he had a key, then why not use it on the front door? I wanted to get out of there and call the cops, because I was almost sure that this was a robbery. I pulled out my flip phone and pretended to read a text message. Then I turned to Jim and said something important came up, but he was on to me. I made a break for it, bolting down the street. I could hear him shouting behind me. I looked back and saw him get into the van as I was running down the street. I sprinted faster, and the sound of the van was close behind. I went through some yards, hopping over fences, anything to put distance between me and that van. I lost him after a couple blocks, then ducked behind a shed and waited until the sound of the van faded. Once I felt safe, I called the cops from my Motorola Razr flip phone. They confirmed the worst. The house's owners hadn't moved in yet. Their stuff was set up by the moving company and an interior decorator, but they weren't even in the country. I'd unknowingly helped in a robbery. At that moment, I thought I could get in trouble for what I did. I asked the police over the phone if I was in trouble, but they assured me that since I didn't know, I would be fine, especially since I called in to report it. After interviewing with the cops, I told them everything I knew. I didn't have the license plate for the van, but with the information I gave them, they were able to track down several sources of security footage. With that, they caught both the van's license plate and several images of myself with Jim. Jim was obviously not his real name, but he was caught later that day. He was arrested, and the stuff was brought back to the house. We also found out that this was not his first visit to that place. He had been robbing that house every day for almost a week. The neighbors didn't notice, because everyone was new. I guess he made off with some smaller things, then he got greedy and needed help. That's where I came in. Jim could have quit while he was ahead, but he wanted more, and he got caught because of that.